I'm Gail Golick, and welcome to The Secret Life of Death, Episode 2, Graffiti. First the Griswolds, then the Dodges, now the Riches? Where did they come from, and how do they fit in? Turns out that Charles C. Rich was the husband of Nellie Dodge, the second child of Gardner and Fanny. Charles Rich, wife Nellie, and their daughter Mary actually lived at the tavern with Nellie's family, showing up there on the 1860 census, and were likely still living at the tavern in 1862 during Charles's military service, hence the letter being found in the house. So, what of this Charles C. Rich, who went AWOL in Washington, D.C. while on assignment procuring horses? Information on Charles's early life is scant. He was born in 1830 near Freeport, Maine. At the time of his marriage to Nellie Dodge in 1858, his profession was listed as bootmaker. As to his Civil War military service, Private Charles C. Rich enlisted in the Army in the fall of 1861, and by Christmas was gone off to train with the 1st New Hampshire Cavalry. By March of 1862, Charles and his company had been sent to Washington, D.C., serving as part of the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry within the Army of the Potomac. But by the middle of May, Charles had already deserted. Why? It's hard to say. Desertion was a notorious problem during the Civil War for North and South alike. The extreme battlefield conditions quickly took their toll on the average enlisted man. But Charles Rich had only arrived in Washington 2 months prior to his desertion and had yet to see any military action, and his excursion into Washington, D.C. to buy horses doesn't come across as sounding terribly stressful. It would seem as though Charles had decided he had already had enough and just walked off, hoping to blend into the city. But blending proved more difficult than Charles Rich had expected. He shows up among Union military documents as an inmate at Forest Hall Prison in February 1863, where he was held on counts of desertion. A letter documenting his transfer from one prison to another was still in his file at the National Archives.
Forest Hall Prison, Georgetown, District of Columbia, February 2nd, 1863. Captain, I send you Charles Rich, deserter from Company M of the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry, for safekeeping. He has been in arrest at the old Capitol Prison and elsewhere, but has invariably succeeded in getting off. He had on his person a forged discharge, which I have in my possession. Please hold him until such time as we send away a squad to Hooker's army, when I will relieve you of all the rare birds turned over from this prison. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Thomas Chamberlain, Major, 150th Pennsylvania Volunteers.
In the early stages of the war, things were not going well for the Union, and the Army was hemorrhaging soldiers going AWOL. Traditionally, deserters were either shot or hanged, but President Lincoln decided it was not in the interest of Army or national morale to hang or shoot men who deserted. Instead, Lincoln wanted to put them back into service with their old regiments, with the understanding they would be closely watched and their pay would be docked for the time they were absent. Major Chamberlain himself covers this issue in another publication, his History of the 150th Pennsylvania Volunteers. He stated that the Forest Hall Prison mentioned in Rich's transfer letter was
occupied as a depot for deserters arrested in all parts of the country. From this point, after the examination and identification, the prisoners were sent from time to time, under guard, to the regiments to which they belonged.
But in Rich's transfer letter, Major Chamberlain gives us a hint that Rich was, perhaps, more than just a scared kid who ran off from his unit. He had been kept in and moved around to several military-run prisons, which in itself was a bit unusual. The old Capitol Prison, where Rich was being transferred, seemed to be reserved for those who did more than just run off. Again, in his History of the 150th Pennsylvania Volunteers, Chamberlain notes that the old Capitol Prison was where men were sent
whose papers were defective or who lacked written evidence of their loyalty.
Throughout the Civil War, the old Capitol Prison was used to house Confederate POWs, prostitutes, political prisoners, Union officers convicted of insubordination, and spies. Remember, Rich's prison transfer letter said that he had been found with forged discharge papers, and that would have been enough for Union officers to question his loyalty. It would not have been unreasonable for them to think Rich might have been a threat. At best, his desertion came across as foolhardy, and at worst, potential espionage. During the winter of 1863, the Union was preparing for their spring and summer campaigns, which were going to require as many able-bodied soldiers as they could find. Major Chamberlain and the 150th Pennsylvania were gearing up to leave Washington for the front by mid-February, the same time as Charles Rich's transfer to the old Capitol Prison. The Union Army was consolidating its AWOL prisoners and perhaps expediting the review of their files in order to release as many soldiers as possible back into service for the battle season that lay ahead. Private Rich's credentials must have eventually checked out, because at some point he was released from the old Capitol Prison and sent back to the 1st New Hampshire Cavalry, where he served until the end of the war, mustering out in July of 1865. For the service he did render, he was paid $100. It's not clear if he was put back into service in the spring of 1863 as Major Chamberlain and other forces began to mobilize. If so, he may have participated in some of the most brutal battles of the whole war. In 1863 alone, Rich's regiment, the 1st New Hampshire Cavalry, fought at Chancellorsville in May and Gettysburg in June. After 1865, all traces of Charles C. Rich evaporate. We don't know whether he ever came back home to Nellie and their child, Mary. But based on what happened next, the best guess is that he died, because by 1868, Nellie married Charles's younger brother, John Rich, and the two had one child, whom they named Charles, presumably after his stepfather? Ugh, yeesh. But Nellie would not find happiness with John Rich either. She, in a series of bold moves for a woman of her time, files for divorce from John in 1877, citing abandonment. We assume that by 1877, John Rich had been gone a while, because in 1874, Nellie had another son named George Amos Gale, with another man, Amos Gale. In 1878, a few months after her divorce from John Rich was final, Nellie married Amos. Double yeesh. In the end, Nellie and Amos settled in Keene, New Hampshire, about 16 miles south of the tavern. But Nellie and her children maintained a close relationship with her family in Walpole. Nellie and Amos were buried in the same cemetery as her parents, Gardner and Fanny, grandparents Reuben and Anna, along with several of her siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Evidence of the Dodge family legacy has so far come from within the walls of the tavern, the footstone in the basement, and the Civil War letter in the attic. But it can also be said that their family history is on the walls, literally.
Oh, I think it's going to look so cool.
That's gonna be
Yeah.
We're standing on the side porch, and in the far corner along the back wall are the names.
You can read it great.
Lists and lines of names.
Since
April 10th.
dates and
Some carved into the wood,
that was Aunt Alice's birthday.
most written in pencil on the whitewashed pine boards. Some clear as day, some faint and vanishing. But there they are, handwritten names. 19th century graffiti.
And then Mom wanted to take the boards down because they don't look very good and put them up in the attic or something, but I didn't want them to come down.
Around 49 different names associated with 3 tenants or owners, dating from between 1880 to at least 1925. The earliest grouping of the names are written under the date 1880 and are associated with the children and grandchildren of Gardner and Fanny Dodge.
Nellie E.,
Mary J. Yardley,
C.H. Rich,
G.A. Rollins,
Henry I. Dodge,
Charles W. Dodge.
John G. Dodge.
1880 was an important year for the Dodge clan. That's the year that patriarch Gardner died. The names of his daughter, Nellie Gale, her children Mary Yardley, Charles Rich, and George Gale appear in the cluster around that date, as well as the names of Nellie's siblings John, Henry, and Charles, along with their first cousin, George Rollins. Perhaps what we're seeing with those names under that date is the commemoration of one of the last gatherings of the children, grandchildren, and cousins at the old family home. It's easy to imagine the family coming back to the house after Gardner's funeral service and burial, eating, chatting, laughing and crying, having a few drinks on the porch of the house they all knew so well. And so, some of the gang wrote their name on the wall to help remember this occasion, and maybe to be remembered beyond it. After the deaths of Gardner in 1880 and Fanny in 1885, activity around the house changed. With the parents gone, the Dodge siblings themselves getting older, and the next generation moving away, the old homestead moved into a new phase of use. The property, run as a farm these many years, was turned over to son Henry, who continued to live and farm there. A story in the local paper, the Walpole Gazette, dated May 1891, gives us a glimpse into Henry's life running the old family farm, albeit a rather bizarre one.
On Saturday last, H.R. Dodge was driving a sow past J.A. Dunnigan's in the valley when she was attacked and worried by 2 vicious dogs, which so enraged and crazed the beast that she started on a raid from farm to farm, attacking everyone who came her way. Mrs. Royce's was protected in her own house by her faithful dog, and several men had their clothing partly torn off and narrowly escaped serious injury. But the hog was finally captured in a ravine behind Mr. Booth's. It required a large part of the enrolled militia of the neighborhood to make the capture.
Ah, yes, the old parable of the militia and the rampaging pig. If I had a dime. By the 1900 census, there's no record of Henry living at the house. Strangely, there's no record of him anywhere, probably an oversight. And instead, living at the tavern is a Harry Jewett and his family. Harry Jewett was the nephew of Henry Dodge, and his occupation was listed as teamster, not farmer. So, who was keeping up with the farm? Maybe Henry? Maybe no one. It's a scenario emblematic of a wider trend. What we see happening here at the tavern around 1900 is the same sorry story endured by the rest of rural New England. Family lines dying out. As the older generations began dying off, there were no younger family members willing or able to take over the family homestead. Many of the younger people had migrated out west or to the cities, and a surprising number of people in Henry Dodge's generation, Henry included, never married, and therefore had no children to pass the estate on to. By 1900, the Dodge Tavern was 100 years old, and its management in decline. The big, once prosperous family farm began to wither into an empty hulk. Local John Prentice recalled this turn-of-the-century transition in his remembrances about the valley.
It is interesting how productive these old farms were and that their owners were able to raise large families. It's surprising how many fine old New England families leave no descendants. It is a sad thought.
Though Henry didn't show up in the 1900 census, we do know he was somewhere in Walpole because he dies there in 1908. After his death, the tavern was sold to Daniel and Margaret O'Brien. The O'Briens owned several houses in the area and never lived at the Dodge Tavern themselves, but instead rented it out to various tenants. It's during the O'Brien ownership that the second group of names was added to the graffiti wall on the porch.
Frank S.
Catherine Griffin and Chad.
Melina Elizabeth Podwin.
Catherine Griffin.
James Doucette.
Annie Doucette.
Catherine and Dan.
Dan Rattray.
Alice McNutt.
Between 1908 and 1918, the tavern was rented out at separate times to sister and brother Elizabeth Rattray McNutt and James Rattray. Based on those names written on the graffiti wall, their large extended family of children, cousins, aunts, and uncles also gathered at the tavern, or, at the very least, on the porch. The McNutts and Rattrays were Canadian immigrants and part of an interesting demographic shift in New England at the turn of the century. Just as families like the Dodges were petering out, new waves of immigrants came to take their place in both the cities and the countryside. Along with the French, Irish, Poles, Italians, Germans, the Rattray McNutt clan settled with their extended family in Walpole, New Hampshire, and rented homes in various parts of town throughout the years, making their way doing carpentry work or picking up day labor jobs. In 1910, James Rattray, his wife Margaret, and James's father Alexander were living at the tavern, and sister Elizabeth McNutt was living in the valley, only a few houses up from her relatives. During this time, the tavern was being rented out as a farm and living space, but the house still had its impressive second-floor expandable rooms, which were, up until the 1920s, being rented out for community dances. We know this from the preserved diaries of Roxana McNutt Thompson, the third daughter of former tenants Elizabeth and Everett McNutt. Roxana Louise McNutt, or Roxy, was born in 1897 in Walpole and lived in various rented homes around town, including the tavern. In 1916, at the age of 18, she married Henry Thompson, another kid from the valley. By the next year, Roxana and Henry had a child, Henry Jr., and they were living in the valley not far from the tavern. Roxy's diary entries document her daily activities and the comings and goings of her friends and family. At first glance, they seem quaint. She cleaned the kitchen. Henry fixed a window. Her parents came over for dinner. But on second reading, we begin to get a sense of what life was like here in the valley during the late 19-teens and early 1920s. There was no electricity here, no telephones, and cars and trucks were not terribly common, so people relied on each other for help and entertainment. People were visiting each other constantly, daily, sometimes back and forth to each other's houses a couple times a day. Socializing was key to their community here. Local John Prentice remembered,
Recreation was mostly of a social sort. social visits from house to house. The younger members visited, often getting together evenings.
But dances were the highlight of social life for these rural communities. In the year 1919 alone, Roxy mentions some 15 dances being given around town, 5 of which were at the tavern. One of the first dances of 1919 was given at the tavern, or Valley Hall as it was also referred. Roxy and her family spent a week preparing for the dance.
Sunday, January 5th, 1919. Cold, 4 degrees below. Katie, Henry, and I went up home and took a load of goods up to the tavern, preparing for a dance. We all worked there cleaning, setting up stoves and making seats, etc. Velnor and Dad were there too, besides all of us girls. Wednesday, January 8th, warm, did my work and went after the mail and over to Flora's. Emma was over there and we visited and had coffee and cocoa and cake and donuts. Junior had a fine time playing with Mary after she got home. They washed the floor in the Valley Hall today. Thursday, January 9th, fair. Ironed and cut out little Henry's romper of gray outing flannel. I tried to teach Big Henry to dance waltzes in one step, but he wouldn't learn, so Junior danced with me. He sings when he dances. Friday, January 10th, cloudy, cold, preparing for dance tonight. I made a cake and a milk pan full of sandwiches. Uncle Jim and Aunt Maggie, Uncle Henry and Aunt Jane, Fred and 3 or 4 other were out from Bellows Falls. Uncle Dan was there and danced with Mama. We all had a fine time, arrived home about 5 a.m. Saturday.
According to Roxy's diary, just about every holiday was celebrated with a dance. New Year's, St. Patrick's Day, graduations, on and on. They'd either be hosted at a private home or someone would rent a place like the tavern. Sometimes there was a fee to offset the cost of the room rental and to pay the band. Everybody brought some food to share, and of course, there were drinks, though Roxy never mentions that specifically. It seems all were welcome, old and young, if the venue had enough room. And these dances could go late, as Roxy mentions not getting home until 5 a.m. For those late parties at the tavern, sleepy children were set up in a back room while the adults continued to tie one on. Along with all the dances at the tavern in 1919, new tenants took up residence. Another immigrant family, this time from Poland, the Domazics. Jacob and Frances Domazic moved into the house with their children, Victoria, 15, Alice, 12, Felix, 1, and Frances's father, Paul Kuzanski. By that time, the farm and its many buildings were in rough shape, as the property suffered a slow decline since the turn of the century. The tavern would have required a tremendous amount of upkeep as it aged, and so understandably some things were let go. The Domazics rented until 1922, when they bought the property from the O'Briens. They ran the place as a small dairy, like most other farms in the valley. They had a large vegetable garden, raised chickens, and a bull calf for beef, which son Felix always remembered as being especially fat. They had a pair of workhorses to pull the farm equipment, as well as logs for their firewood and for cordwood to sell. For the most part, they carried on here much as they had back in Poland. And though life on the Domazic farm was hard, it was a far cry from the deprivations Jacob and Frances experienced in their homeland. They told their children that back home, even wood was scarce for people like them. When a tree was cut down, people would dig up the stump for every last bit of wood. Their life in America must have seemed like a dream, because here they owned acres of woodlot. Here they owned a large house. Here, even their cows were fat. When the Domazics took over the tavern, there was a lot of work to do. They had to tear down many of the old dilapidated outbuildings, as well as the L off the back of the house. The years of use and neglect had taken their toll and left the house in a state, especially the plaster ceilings and the first floor rooms directly under the ballroom where the dances were held. The years of dancing feet had buckled the plaster ceilings, so much so that the Domajics would not allow the house to be used for dances anymore. The Domajics wanted to use their whole house to accommodate their multi-generational family. And although the Dodge Tavern never hosted a community dance again, it still played host to gatherings of the young Domajic girls and their friends, as commemorated by the third group of names on the graffiti wall.
Willard Marlowe,
Jesse Grout,
Johnny Grout,
Clarence Marlowe,
Wallace Marlowe,
Edward Marlowe,
Jean and Ruth,
Franny and Lewis,
Louis Pratt,
Alice Domajic,
Gordon Bashaw,
Wilford Bashaw.
The people listed in that grouping were all residents of the valley around 1920, schoolmates and friends of teenagers Victoria and Alice Domajic. There's another set of names presented in boy-girl pairs with a large heart drawn around the entire grouping.
Wilford B., Alice D.,
Edwin B., Blanche L.,
Joseph K., Victoria K.,
Herbert W., and Mary K.
Are we looking at the love interests of the Domajic girls and their friends? That seems plausible, as Victoria Domajic became Victoria K. after marrying Joe Kilburn in 1922, but none of the other pairings resulted in marriages, and by all accounts, the rest of the boy-girl matches were between people who were absolute polar opposites. So, probably just the girls joking and teasing one another about boys. Some things never change. In 1930, Victoria and Joe and their 4 children were living at the tavern along with parents Jacob and Francis, as well as their youngest, 13-year-old son Felix. By 1940, Victoria and her family had moved to a house of their own in Walpole, leaving Jacob, Francis, and Felix at the tavern running their dairy farm. And it's at this time we find some familiar names pop back up amongst the next-door neighbors, Roxana and Henry Thompson. However, this is not the same Roxy Thompson who wrote the diary about the dances at the tavern 20 years earlier. This 1940 census entry is for Henry Sr. and his daughters, Roxana and Harriet, as well as Henry Sr.'s sister, Emma Boynton. Henry Jr. was still in town, but married with a family of his own. Mother Roxy was, well, there's more to her story. After we left Roxy McNutt Thompson and her diary of the dances in 1919, her life got very busy. She made entries towards the end of August and all throughout September about feeling sick, having headaches and stomach aches and feeling exhausted. She obliquely references these issues for weeks until
September 21st, 1919. I don't feel very well. We all went up home to dinner. I didn't have to tell Mama the good news. She knew it before I told her. Little Henry is a darling. He will hug me and kiss me and ask if I am sick. Big Henry makes tea for me every morning and takes it upstairs for me. He is awful good to me.
Looking back from the future, we know how the story ends, so it's fun to see their lives unfold in real time, hint by hint, knowing what's coming. Another baby, daughter Roxana. Over the next few years, in addition to Henry Jr. and daughter Roxana, there would be a third child born, Harriet. The family would move from the valley and the community where they had spent their whole lives up to that point, when Henry Sr. got a job managing an orchard in Bennington, Vermont. Of course, there's a flip side to knowing how a story ends. Knowing what else is coming for the Thompsons, we are acutely aware of all that Roxy left out of her diary. Roxy's pains, headaches, and tiredness were not all the result of her pregnancy. She was also sick with tuberculosis, likely infected when her older sister Mary died from TB in 1911. Roxy struggled to keep up with the demands of her life and would even be confined to a sanitarium for a while after Harriet's birth in 1921. Roxy eventually left the sanitarium and made it back to their home at the Bennington, Vermont orchard Henry Sr. managed, but she vowed never to be separated from her children again. A subsequent diary covers her convalescence and their life in Bennington, where Roxy talks of spending much of her time over the winter of 1925 to 26 bundled up in a bed set up on the porch. Bed rest and exposure to dry, fresh air was the standard treatment for TB in the pre-antibiotic era. Doctors could only treat the symptoms and believed that rest and clean air helped calm the illness and comfort the patients. Roxy's diary entries that winter are just as straightforward as before. Weather, the kids, what they ate, who stopped by for a visit, but they were sporadic.
Friday, February 12, 1926. Great day. Sun shone all day long. Was out all day. Dr. Hurley came up. My right lung has been bothering me. He says my right lung is worse. He gave me some medicine to stop my cough. Mrs. Brennenstall came down in PM. Henry got me some fillers for my sputum box. No letters today.
The next and final diary entry is dated Monday, February 15th, 1926. A tear-stained page with one sentence at the top, written in husband Henry's hand. Dear Roxy has gone. After Roxy's death, Henry Sr. was put in a difficult situation. He had 3 young children to care for, a job to do, and his own grief to deal with. He turned back to their families in New Hampshire for help. Roxana's parents, Elizabeth and Everett McNutt, took all 3 children for a year. After that, Henry Jr. went back to Bennington to live with his father, and the girls, Roxana and Harriet, stayed in Walpole with their paternal aunt, Emma Boynton. It's here that our story arcs back to the tavern. By 1940, all of the Thompsons were back in the valley. In fact, they were more or less next-door neighbors with the Domajics. And, as they say, proximity breeds familiarity. So it wasn't long before young Roxana Thompson and the Domajics' son, Felix, became an item. The couple would go on to play an important role in the next phase of life at the tavern. Roxana and Felix married in 1946 and moved into a converted apartment on the 2nd floor of the tavern, the same house Roxana's mother, grandparents, great-uncle, and great-grandfather, the McNutts and the Rattrays, had called home 30 years before. Roxana and Felix would live the rest of their lives at the tavern, taking care of Felix's elderly parents in turn, as well as the aunt who helped raise Roxana and her sister. They were, like the generations before them, extremely industrious and hard-working. They ran a 15 to 20 head dairy farm until 1957, then raised heifers into the 1990s. On top of the farming, they started a sawmill on the property, cut and sold hay, made wooden pallets, and more. They raised 3 children in the house: Susan, William, and Judith, or Judy, as in Judy Northcott, my mother-in-law. Over the years, that farm served as the touchstone for Roxana and Felix's children and grandchildren, with countless memories of Sunday dinners prepared by Roxana on her wood-burning cook stove, and long, productive days at Felix's side, mending pasture fences and learning to drive the tractor. Felix and Roxana remained in the house until their respective deaths in 1996 and 2013, with Judy and Scott Northcott moving into the place in 2014. The physical changes observed in this old house throughout its 215 years directly reflect the cultural, social, and economic experiences of rural New England. This house was born and thrived in the era of the stagecoach. When stage travel was bypassed by the rail, it rebranded itself as an expansive farm. When much of the local population moved out west and the large farms were abandoned, the property turned a page and welcomed motivated immigrants who revitalized the farm. And finally, as farming became less stable, it morphed into the multi-use property we see today. It's October, and tonight, the tavern is hosting a haunted house, put together by the 7th generation of the family to consider this place home. For months, the nephews and their Grammy have turned 3 floors of this house into a series of terrifying tableaus. All must enter, and no one is spared from running the gauntlet. Those traditions of sharing, visiting, and gathering seem to transcend time. We add ours to the millions of personal moments witnessed by this house, the details of which have evaporated with time. If you're sentimental, you can think about how many laughs were had around a card table, how many barrels of rum and cider were rolled across these floors, how many babies were born here, how many people died. This home is the anchor of our family, as it was no doubt the anchor to the Griswolds and the Dodges before us. There's something both familiar and comforting, knowing you're part of a lineage who once walked these same floors, sat in these same rooms. It's a connection that, even in this modern age, humans yearn for. We seek it out, in fact. In the 1970s, a man named Vernon Rich stopped by the house in search of that connection. He came to the place that still bears his family's name, the Dodge Tavern. The very place the names of his father, uncle, aunt, grandmother, and cousins cover the graffiti wall, and his great-grandfather's footstone lay hidden in the cellar. Vernon was likely inspired to come by his own family's stories. Enough so to go to a place he had never been, knock on the door of a stranger, for a chance to walk the floors and sit in the rooms where his family once lived and breathed. History has a history problem, in that it's rarely written by the people who actually lived it. It's left to later generations to deal with. Generations with 20/20 hindsight and a tendency to cajole and remodel details, propping up an idealized version of the past. And any detail or event or person that falls short of this standard is intentionally overlooked. History becomes sanitized, monotonized, and therefore inaccurate and boring. It's never just one piece that makes a puzzle. The overall aggregation of pieces makes the picture complete. On its own, what can you really learn from just a solitary name or date? But put those names and dates into the context of their time, and give them a physical place, like the Dodge Tavern, and suddenly, a name becomes more than a name.
Alice McNutt.
John G. Dodge.
Catherine Griffin.
G.A. Rollins. Charles W. Dodge.
And a date? More than a date.
February 1802. July 1st, 1862.
Sunday, January 5th, 1919.
doesn't always have to be about the first this or the biggest that, the most profitable whatever. The true representation of history has to include everybody, even the regular people, living their regular lives. It's still there, you know. You just need to look and listen. You've heard the saying, if these walls could talk. If? See, I think they do.
Thursday, January 9th, fair. Ironed and cut out little Henry's romper of gray outing flannel. I tried to teach Big Henry.
James Doucette,
Annie Doucette.
Catherine, and Dan.
Of course, that where it was now is not where it was all through the years.
1802. This may certify, to whom it may concern, that the smallpox is entirely removed from the public road.
Charles C. Rich was detailed about the 1st of May to go to Washington after horses. There he left the party, and we have heard nothing of
The old barn was where the horses were stabled, and it had a secret cellar under the floor of the grain room.
I find it so hard to wrap my head around the fact that entire lives come and go before you even get here.
Wonderful. Okay. Stage 33 Live would like to thank a few folks for what they've done to allow us to be here for this month and bring some wonderful, wonderful programming and entertainment to you folks. And I'd like to give some shout-outs to the Island Corporation, the Ben & Jerry's Foundation, Wool FM, Black Sheep Radio, Jan and Mike from the Milk House Heaters, got Whistler's mother, Mark Attardi, Gail Golick, hi, and Daniel Hardigan, Bob Osborne, David Shaw, Kyle Alicon, and What Doth Life, the Greater Falls Farmers Market, Keen Idol, Gary Smith, Jessica Reeves, and other local supporters who shouldn't be overlooked but probably are, who are the main reason why this venue is in front of you today. And I just really wanted to give a shout out to those folks for all they've done, the effort, the donations that have made it so we can be here and present this to you. So I'll give it back to Gail and have fun asking questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much. If they're, I'm just going to use the microphone because they're recording this, if we didn't mention that before, so that Stage 33 can use the question and answer period in my little introduction for the, it's not live streamed right now, but they'll take it back and then they're going to put together a video of what you just saw and then sort of sandwich the front and end part onto it. So you don't have to get up and talk into the microphone, but if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll see if we have some of the people who participated in the show here with us this evening, and we'll see if we can't embarrass them. It's always fun. Nobody? Nothing? You just want cookies? That's understandable. Yes. All right, right here, front row.
Where did you find all of your photos and old newspaper records and stuff?
Okay, sure. Her question was about where I came up with the photos and some of the archival pieces from the show. Luckily, a lot of the historical photos came from my mother-in-law. Like I said, she and her family have maintained wonderful records over the years. And all the photos are labeled, and I can't stress this enough. If you know who's in an old photo, put a label on it, because 100 years from now, someone will be very happy you did that. And so luckily, they're all labeled, and we knew who everybody was. And I did a lot of research at the State Archives in Concord, New Hampshire, and those were just screenshots of the microfilm that they have all of the excuse me, have a lot of the newspapers on, and so those were my photographs of the screen for the microfilm. And even some of the letters and things like that had come from, usually I had the source of the reference there too. So some of the things for the National Archives with the letter about the Civil War guy, and the letter itself that came from the house, that was courtesy of my mother-in-law as well. Yes?
How long did it take you to compile all that information?
This probably took me about, the whole thing from beginning to end was a little more than a year. And I wasn't working on it full time. I have jobs in between here and there, so it was when I had time to go over to Concord and do the research, or come to the studio to do some recording, or spend time at my computer and do some of the editing. But a lot of it is stuff that I've picked up on over the years, and have this little Rolodex in the back of my head that I'm going to come back to this, or something like that. But it's it's a lot of fun for me to do, so it doesn't really seem like work. So it's hard for me to say where work began and the fun part of it ended for me, because it was all just, weekends and evenings and mornings and stuff like that. I just really enjoy the research part of it. So a lot of time, but I was happy to do it. Yes.
How hard was it to decipher all the names on the wall, like in the pencil?
Well, some of them, as you could see from the pictures, it was pretty obvious what some of them were. And well, the great thing about digital photography nowadays is you can take a picture and then mess with the different tones in it, and that'll help bring things out. But luckily, again, Judy's family, that's all of them pretty much. So she could, if it looked like an A, like, oh, that's probably Alice. Oh yeah, that looks like Alice. And so we were able to figure out a lot of those, just because we knew who was going to be at the house anyway. And again, some of them were pretty clear, and other ones, some you can't tell really what it is anymore at all, which is too bad. But we've been doing, I think that's one of the ideas, is that get a really good camera and take some really nice photos, and because I was just doing most of it with my cell phone, which again is better than the fancy camera I have. But you can really get away with a really nice camera, can probably archive that stuff really well. So that's definitely in the plan. Yes?
Why do you think those letters were hidden away where they were hidden?
It's not an uncommon thing in old houses to have people find stuff tucked down, or they just naturally fall down. It was maybe in a box or a basket or something, which no longer, just has rotted away over the years. Or there's floorboards up there now. There never used to be. That's something that Judy's mother had done, excuse me, just a few, probably in the last 10 or 15 years. So there were just sort of open joists in the floor, so there may have been boxes and things left up there. Or if it was, the idea of it being something kind of scandalous, was being hidden and tucked away. It wasn't probably for the family, not a very great letter to get that this guy took off, and they kept it, but we can't really say exactly what their intent was. Were they actually hiding it, or was it just a natural thing that happened to fall down in between the walls? But I've come across that in a number of cases where people will find stuff that when they're doing remodels that has just naturally fallen down, because there's no insulation in any of these old houses. They're just basically these big cavities in between the walls, and so that sort of becomes default as things get moved around and shuffled around over 100 years. It's not surprising some things might slip down literally between the cracks.
Was there any World War I or World War II connections of people going off to fight?
Nothing that popped up. There weren't a lot of boys in the families that were living there during that time period. The McNutts and Rattrays were mostly girls, and they were, and then the Demajics were a little bit young, and again the younger ones were the boys. So that sort of. They weren't born until after the World War I, but yeah.
Felix didn't go
right
during World War II because he was a farmer. and the farmers were encouraged not to fight.
Right.
To raise crops.
Right. So he was the like, he could have, but he was sort of the running the farm at that point, and so that was he probably wanted to go, but
Julie said they wouldn't take him.
right.
The guy that was the bootmaker, wouldn't it have been better to use him as a bootmaker instead of having him fight?
Yeah, in retrospect, since he took off anyway, but. Any other comments, questions? This was a wonderful first run for me. I can see some things that I probably need to modify, but I appreciate you guys coming and sitting through it. I know it was kind of long, but it was just a different style, a different format that I wanted to try out, and you were great guinea pigs, so I appreciate you giving up your Sunday evening for, science and history. But if there are no more comments or questions, one more, okay, or it can be more. Doesn't have to be one.
Do you have any information on the original size of the house's land parcel and what it is now?
We do. It's nothing that I went into extravagant detail in researching. Unfortunately, a lot of the old deeds are very difficult to read because they talk about 50 rods past such and such a tree and past such and such a, they talk about abutters, and so you end up having to research who are all the abutters at the same time, and so that it's not as, there's no maps, of course, and it gets very difficult to figure out. It can be done, but it's very difficult to go through and to pinpoint so many this and that, and now a lot of the area has stone walls, which does make a difference, but early on there weren't any stone walls, so you're just basing it off of a tree that is not there anymore, so it can be kind of a pain and not something I find all that much fun. But anybody else? All right, again, thank you so much, and thanks, I appreciate it.